The crack of a twig echoed through the frozen forest. Mark Thornton froze mid-step, rifle half raised. 20 years in these woods had taught him one thing: silence meant survival. But the sound that followed pierced him deeper than any bullet could. A low, guttural moan, primal, desperate, carrying through the bitter winter air. The distress call of a dying bear. What happened next defied every hunting instinct Mark possessed. The starving pregnant bear should have been either a threat to avoid or prey to harvest. Instead, she became something impossible. A responsibility. A wild creature whose fate unexpectedly intertwined with his own. Mark never told anyone about the weeks that followed. Who would believe him? A hardened hunter secretly feeding a pregnant bear through the harshest winter in decades. He assumed their connection ended with spring's first thaw. Until exactly 1 year later, when a sound so distinct, so deliberate, reached his ears that the man who hadn't cried since childhood found tears streaming down his weathered face. Nature had sent him a message no human was ever meant to hear. At 48 years old, Mark had spent more time in these woods than most people spend in their offices. His father had taught him to hunt on these same trails, and his grandfather before that. The Thornton men respected what they hunted, understood the delicate balance of taking only what was needed. Mark was no trophy hunter. He came to the wilderness not just for game, but for the profound silence that cleared his mind of life's complications. This particular December had brought an unusually early and severe winter. Mark's cabin, a simple one-room structure his grandfather had built by hand, stood as his base camp 5 miles from the nearest dirt road. He had planned this hunting trip months in advance, securing the necessary permits and preparing his gear with meticulous attention. On the third morning, Mark woke before dawn. After a simple breakfast of instant coffee and oatmeal, he dressed in layers, grabbed his rifle, and stepped into the biting cold. 4 hours into his hunt, something felt wrong. Mark paused, examining tree bark stripped in an unusual pattern. These claw marks seemed desperate, erratic. Most concerning were the drops of blood mingled with tracks in the snow, bright crimson against pure white. As the short winter day began to fade, the tracks led him to a small clearing. Mark raised his binoculars and saw a dark shape huddled against a fallen log, nearly motionless except for labored breathing. A bear, but not just any bear. A female, her distended belly evidence of pregnancy, her frame showing signs of severe malnourishment. In all his years, Mark had never seen a pregnant bear in such desperate condition. He should walk away. Every rational thought told him to retreat, to let nature take its course. But Mark Thornton stood frozen, locked in a moment of decision that would change everything. Mark crouched low behind a thick pine, his rifle secured across his back. From this safer vantage point, he studied the bear more carefully. She was a black bear, not fully grown, but certainly not a juvenile. Her coat lacked the healthy shine it should have had, instead appearing patchy and dull. Most alarming was her frame. Even in winter, a bear should carry substantial body mass, especially a pregnant female preparing for hibernation and birth. This bear was alarmingly thin. Her ribs showed through her fur, and her movements were sluggish, lacking the power and precision bears naturally possessed. Mark noted how she pawed weakly at the frozen ground, likely searching for any remnants of food. The distended belly seemed even more pronounced against her otherwise skeletal frame. Normal black bears would have entered their dens by now, living off fat reserves accumulated during summer and fall. This female had clearly failed to build those essential reserves. Whatever the cause, Mark knew she faced certain death without intervention. A starving mother meant cubs that would never survive birth. He watched her struggle to her feet, swaying slightly before collapsing back against the log. A low moan escaped her, a sound so filled with suffering that it seemed to physically touch Mark. The bear's eyes struck him most profoundly. They lacked the wildness, the ferocity he'd seen in every other bear encounter throughout his life. Instead, they held resignation, the acceptance of coming death. Mark's hands tightened around his rifle instinctively. The hunter in him knew the most merciful action might be a clean shot. End her suffering quickly. But something else stirred within him, something that went beyond hunter instinct. The bear had fought hard enough to survive this long while carrying unborn cubs. There was a determination there that resonated with something deep in Mark's own character. Never feed a wild animal, his father had repeated countless times. You doom them by making them dependent. Yet as twilight deepened around them, painting the snow in purple shadows, Mark found himself caught between two powerful forces. The pregnant bear looked directly at him then, as if sensing his presence despite his careful concealment. Their eyes met across the clearing, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between predator and prey, hunter and hunted. Mark lowered his rifle. Against everything he had ever been taught, against common sense itself, he would try to help this bear survive. The journey back to his cabin through the twilight forest gave Mark time to question his sanity. At the cabin, Mark pulled his laptop from his pack and connected to the satellite internet he rarely used. All night he researched black bear nutrition, pregnancy, and winter feeding habits. He learned that bears needed high-calorie foods rich in protein and fat to survive winter, especially pregnant females. "This is madness," Mark muttered, as he scribbled notes on what foods might help the bear survive. By morning, he had created a plan and a shopping list. The trip to town took 3 hours of dangerous driving through snow-covered mountain roads. At the general store, Mark filled his cart with items that earned him curious stares from the cashier. Jars of honey, cans of salmon, bags of nuts, dried fruits, and several pounds of bacon. He added some high-calorie protein bars meant for extreme hikers and 2 gallons of cooking oil. "Stocking up for the apocalypse?" the cashier joked. Mark forced a smile. "Just don't like making the trip too often." The next challenge was finding the bear again. Mark tracked her for hours before locating her a quarter-mile from their first encounter. She had found minimal shelter beneath a rocky overhang, a poor substitute for a proper hibernation den. Her condition appeared even worse in daylight. Mark retreated to a safe distance downwind and prepared the first feeding. He mixed honey with nuts and dried berries, added crushed protein bars, and soaked everything in calorie-rich oil. With careful movements, Mark approached the area, stopping 100 yards from her shelter. He left the opened cooler on a flat rock and backed away. The risks weighed heavily on his mind. A fed bear could become dependent on humans, lose natural foraging abilities, or worse, associate people with food. Moreover, despite her weakened state, she remained a powerful predator. Mark watched from a distance as the scent finally reached her. The bear raised her head, nostrils flaring. When she finally found the food, she devoured it with surprising speed, licking the container clean. That night in his cabin, Mark contemplated the line he had crossed. He decided to name the bear Aurora, after the northern lights that danced above the mountains on clear winter nights. For the next week, Mark established a careful routine. Each morning and evening, he left food at gradually increasing distances from Aurora's makeshift den, forcing her to walk a little further each time, building strength. He varied the mixtures. sometimes leaving fish or bacon, other times nuts and dried fruits. The danger never left his mind. Once, arriving earlier than usual, he found Aurora already at the feeding site. She stood up on hind legs upon seeing him, and for a terrifying moment, Mark thought she might charge. He froze, heart pounding, hand instinctively moving toward the pistol at his hip. But Aurora simply watched him, dropped back to all fours, and waited patiently for him to leave the food and back away. A strange trust was forming, a relationship that defied the natural order. Mark knew he walked a dangerous line between rescue and interference. Still, each day, as he observed subtle improvements in Aurora's condition, he convinced himself that this extraordinary intervention was worth the risk. December deepened, bringing heavier snow and bitter temperatures that tested Mark's resolve. His original 2-week hunting trip stretched to 3 weeks, then 4. He called home with vague explanations about plentiful game and perfect conditions, omitting entirely the true reason for his extended stay. Each day followed a similar pattern. Before dawn, Mark would prepare the morning meal for Aurora, mixing different combinations of high-calorie foods. He learned what she preferred. Honey was a clear favorite, and the oilier fish always disappeared first. Mark kept meticulous notes of her eating habits and physical changes in a small notebook, documenting this unbelievable journey. By the 3rd week, Aurora had established a routine of her own. She would appear at the feeding site minutes after Mark departed, as if she had been watching from a distance. Her movements grew stronger, more deliberate. The desperate scramble for food transformed into a more dignified, measured approach. Most encouraging was the gradual filling out of her frame, fat slowly building over her once visible ribs. One snowy afternoon, Mark arrived to find Aurora had dug a more substantial den beneath a fallen pine. The natural shelter offered better protection from the elements, a sign she was regaining enough energy for self-preservation. Mark moved the feeding site closer to her new home, allowing her to conserve energy for healing and nurturing her unborn cubs. The most remarkable change came in late December. Aurora began acknowledging Mark's presence with a series of low huffs, not threatening growls, but something like recognition. From the safety of his observation point, Mark watched her raise her head when he arrived, nostrils working to catch his scent. Sometimes she would sit patiently, waiting for him to leave the food, her eyes following his movements with intelligent awareness. "I'm not your friend," Mark would remind himself daily, "just helping you through a rough patch." Yet, despite his best efforts to maintain emotional distance, Mark found himself increasingly invested in Aurora's survival. He observed subtle changes in her appearance that gave him hope. Her fur regaining some luster, her eyes becoming more alert, her belly growing rounder as her cubs developed. By the end of the 4th week, Aurora had gained significant weight. Her movements were fluid again, powerful in a way that both reassured and reminded Mark of the wild creature she truly was. The resignation he'd first seen in her eyes had been replaced by something fierce and determined. The will of a mother preparing to bring new life into the harsh winter world. New Year's Day brought a startling revelation. When Mark arrived at the feeding site, Aurora was not immediately visible. After scanning the area carefully, he spotted her deeper in the tree line. Her belly hung lower than before, and her movements had become deliberate and cautious. Mark recognized the signs from his research. Aurora was days, perhaps hours, away from giving birth. The timing coincided with what he had read about black bear reproduction. Cubs typically arrived in January or February, while the mother remained in hibernation. Aurora had regained enough health to sustain herself and her coming offspring, her body now rounded with the fat reserves she needed. Mark retreated to his cabin, and prepared what he knew would be his final offering. He gathered everything remaining and created the most substantial meal yet. This would be Aurora's last supplement, enough to carry her through the critical birthing period when she would be at her most vulnerable. At dawn the next morning, Mark approached Aurora's den with uncharacteristic heaviness in his steps. He placed the food farther from her den than usual, not wanting to draw predators too close to where her cubs would soon arrive. "This is goodbye, Aurora," he whispered. "The rest is up to you." Mark lingered longer than was prudent, memorizing the landscape, fixing in his mind the location of her den. He would not return to check on her. That was the final gift he could offer, complete freedom from human interference. Aurora's cubs needed to grow wild, untainted by human contact, learning to forage and survive as nature intended. As he hiked back to his cabin to pack for his long-delayed return home, uncertainty clouded Mark's thoughts. Had he done enough? Would Aurora and her cubs survive the remaining winter months? Mark had no way of knowing if his unorthodox intervention would ultimately matter. The familiar crunch of snow beneath Mark's boots brought back a flood of memories. December had returned to the Black Ridge Mountains, and with it, Mark Thornton. His annual hunting trip had arrived right on schedule, though this year felt profoundly different. He deliberately chose the same cabin, following tradition despite the distracting memories it evoked. Throughout the year, thoughts of Aurora had surfaced unexpectedly during quiet moments. Had she survived? Had her cubs lived? The questions remained unanswered, and Mark had convinced himself to expect nothing. The first day passed uneventfully as Mark settled into the cabin. On the second morning, he ventured out for an initial scouting trip, focusing on deer trails rather than thoughts of bears. The forest felt unusually still, even for winter. The silence itself seemed watchful. By midday, Mark had covered several miles when an unusual sound stopped him mid-stride. At first, he couldn't identify it. Not quite a growl, not exactly a huff, something between communication and warning. The sound came again, slightly louder, from somewhere to his left. Mark turned slowly, scanning the trees and seeing nothing but unbroken white and shadow. The sensation of being observed intensified as he made his way back to the cabin. Every few minutes, he would pause, certain that eyes were tracking his movement through the forest. Yet each time he turned, he found only empty wilderness. That evening, as Mark prepared a simple dinner, the feeling persisted. Twice he moved to the window, peering into the gathering darkness. Once he thought he saw movement at the forest edge, a darker shadow shifting against the night. By the third day, Mark's hunter senses were on high alert. Something was definitely circling his cabin, something intelligent enough to remain just out of sight. Something that seemed to be studying him with as much curiosity as he felt toward it. On the fourth morning of his trip, Mark woke before dawn, determined to identify whatever had been stalking his cabin. A fresh dusting of snow had fallen overnight, perfect for tracking. He dressed warmly, tucked his hunting knife into his belt, and loaded his rifle, not with the intention of using it, but as a precaution. The pre-dawn darkness shrouded the forest in deep blue shadows as Mark stepped outside. The air cut sharply into his lungs, even colder than previous days. He stood motionless on the cabin porch, allowing his senses to attune to the wilderness around him. For several minutes, nothing stirred. Then, breaking the perfect silence, came a sound that sent a jolt through Mark's entire body. A soft, melodic humming, there was no other way to describe it, emanated from beyond the tree line. The sound rose and fell in distinct patterns, almost like a mother's lullaby, yet unmistakably not human. Mark had heard bears make many sounds throughout his decades in the wilderness. The warning huffs, the aggressive growls, the clicking of teeth when agitated. This was entirely different. The vocalization carried a gentleness that seemed impossible coming from a wild predator. The sound paused, then repeated with subtle variations. Mark realized with astonishment that it was moving, circling the perimeter of the clearing where his cabin stood. Whatever made these sounds wanted him to hear them from different directions, as if intentionally drawing his attention. Mark stepped off the porch and moved cautiously toward the tree line where the sound had first originated. The humming immediately stopped. He froze, waiting. After nearly a minute of silence, a new sound emerged. 3 distinct short huffs, followed by a unique clicking sound, then repeated in exactly the same pattern. The precision of it struck Mark as deliberate, even calculated. "That's impossible," he whispered to himself. The sound came again, now from his right, the same exact pattern. 3 huffs, the unusual clicking. Pause. Repeat. Mark took 3 deliberate steps in that direction. The vocalization immediately moved farther away, maintaining distance but continuing the pattern. "It wants me to follow," Mark realized aloud. For the rest of the morning, the mysterious vocalizations continued intermittently. Sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly close to the cabin. Each time Mark tried to locate the source, it would relocate before he got close. The sounds followed no timeline he recognized from normal bear activity patterns, coming at random intervals that seemed calculated to maintain his attention. By afternoon, Mark had filled several pages in his notebook, documenting the vocal patterns, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. One thing became increasingly clear. These sounds were directed specifically at him, with an intelligence and purpose that challenged everything he understood about wildlife communication. On the 5th day, Mark's curiosity overcame his caution. After hearing the distinctive pattern of sounds approaching closer to his cabin than ever before, he followed the vocalizations deeper into the forest. The tracks in the snow were unmistakable. Bear prints, a large set accompanied by smaller ones. Mark's heart raced as he followed them, maintaining a respectful distance. The sounds grew louder, more deliberate, as if encouraging his approach while still setting boundaries. After nearly a mile of careful tracking, the forest opened into a small clearing. Mark stopped at its edge, frozen in disbelief at the scene before him. There, in the center of the clearing, stood Aurora. Her transformation was remarkable, her coat now thick and glossy, her frame powerful and healthy. But it was not Aurora alone that caused Mark's breath to catch. Romping playfully around her were 2 cubs, about the size of medium dogs, their dark fur contrasting against the snow as they tumbled and wrestled with each other. Aurora looked directly at Mark, showing no sign of alarm at his presence. Instead, she made that same melodic humming sound he had been hearing. The cubs immediately stopped playing and looked toward their mother. Aurora repeated the sound, then added the 3 huff pattern followed by the distinctive click. The cubs turned their attention to Mark, curious but unafraid. Aurora took several steps toward Mark, still making the gentle vocalizations. She stopped about 30 yards away, close enough for clear observation but maintaining a safe distance. Then she did something that defied explanation. She sat down in the snow, still looking at Mark, and made a new sound, softer, almost like a purr, while her cubs cautiously approached to sit beside her. In that moment, Mark understood the profound message being communicated across the species barrier. Aurora recognized him. More incredibly, she remembered that he had helped her. Now she was showing her cubs that this particular human was not a threat, perhaps the only human they should not fear. The sound Aurora made next changed everything. Looking directly at Mark, she produced a deep, resonant call that rose slightly before tapering off, repeating it 3 times with perfect precision. This specific vocalization, one researchers would later tell him, was used exclusively by mother bears to signal absolute safety to their cubs, pierced through Mark's carefully maintained composure. Tears welled unexpectedly in his eyes, streaming down his weathered cheeks into his beard where they froze in the cold mountain air. His rifle slipped from his shoulder, forgotten in the snow beside him. "You remember me," he whispered, voice breaking. "You brought them to meet me." The realization that this wild predator had not only survived because of his help, but had carried the memory through changing seasons, overwhelmed him completely. More incredibly, she was now deliberately teaching her cubs about him, marking him as unique among humans, as someone to trust rather than fear. Mark sank to his knees, years of stoic restraint dissolving in the face of this extraordinary connection. Here in the depths of the wilderness, witnessed only by the bears and the silent forest, he surrendered completely to the wonder of what was happening. When he finally composed himself, Mark noticed Aurora and her cubs watching from the edge of the clearing with what seemed like patient understanding. Standing slowly, he left his rifle where it had fallen. With deliberate movements, he backed away, bowing his head in profound respect. He would return to these mountains year after year, but never again as a hunter. Aurora had given him the most precious gift, the knowledge that compassion could echo across the seemingly impassable divide between species, returning when least expected to touch the heart of the one who had offered it. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story of connection between humans and wildlife, please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring content. We share incredible animal rescue stories, wildlife encounters, and moments that remind us of our profound connection to nature. Join our community of animal lovers and never miss another touching story that will warm your heart and restore your faith in compassion. Click subscribe now and become part of our wildlife appreciation family.